Jim, I don't know about that photo of you. I was looking at that yesterday. And I was like, oh.
Yeah. You're all alone.
We can change
Yeah,
the
my team.
cameras now.
Let's get off that quickly, shall we? All right.
What kind of indicators can we get?
So on activity 4.1, applying USAID tools for crisis and conflict really has, I'm going to jump forward and come back, has three main areas. The first was, rollout of an already existing draft USAID checklist on conflict sensitivity. I think most of us have been through this, so I'm not going to go too much into detail. 2, revision of an existing USAID rapid needs assessment guide for education in conflict and crisis. And then 3rd, looking forward into developing new guidance and tools on designing conflict sensitive education programs. So really you'll see that the first deliverable was, the first 2 are modifying what's existing. And then the 3rd is looking more ahead into some newer territory. Now, on 4.1, that involved a lot of maybe, shall we say, active feedback loops and adaptation. We began thinking that we would just move straight ahead, develop some consultative moments so that we could check in with the wider conflict and education community on what seems to really work on conflict sensitivity, conflict analysis, and education programming. And I think we had a useful step back with USAID to say, let's broaden that meeting, that conversation, and look at the relationship between conflict sensitivity, equitable access. And we had a consultation around on the margins of the CIES meeting, which many of you were at, and that was quite useful. So I think that was a useful step back. That also helped inform us in terms of whether we wanted to have this activity focus only in on the existing conflict sensitivity checklist, or did we want to broaden it? So we took some initial steps, such as looking into the reports of the initial pilot rollouts of the conflict sensitivity checklist. We had the consultation, which was broader than the checklist itself. It was more broadly on conflict and its interaction with equitable access. And we decided that we wanted to hold on the activity of rolling out the checklist and move the conversation into the professional development realm, which is the next objective, objective 5, and explore a conflict sensitivity type of 101 professional development exercise, of which the checklist could be a part. But we felt the need, and we had feedback from many folks, that this was something that just needed a broader take. So we held on the checklist, and I've moved some of my attention to working with Mary, who's not here, under objective 5, it will come up, on a professional development exercise for on conflict sensitivity 101. Everything from, I'll stop on this point, everything from what, for new staff moving into a conflict affected environment, how should you adjust your expectations? What is expected of you? What's the environment like, and so forth, over to something much more specific for the much more well-versed and well-steeped professional that could be more tailored and customized to that person who's more experienced. So we held on this activity, and under quarter 2, as you can see, the content that I just mentioned is under development as part of objective 5. And under quarter 3, quarter 4, we're hoping to have the first conflict sensitivity program development modules done. So working with Mary Burns on that, okay? Also, that consultation, bullet 2 under quarter 1 here, the consultation we had on the margins of the CIS has been useful to inform this whole objective, in fact. So I'll move then to 4.2, which is something I'm very involved in right now, which is the revision of the existing RNAG. If I say that, people know what I'm talking about. A draft rapid needs assessment guide for education in conflict and crisis. It was developed maybe a year ago, and its intention was basically, it recognized the fact that the education needs assessments that are happening are becoming lighter and less heavy. And so what the RNAG did, which was useful, is integrating conflict analysis and education, rapid needs assessment for education in conflict and crisis. And so it's a very useful effort. And I think what we're doing right now is we had an initial first conversation with a number of stakeholders, which was quite a small conversation. A couple of you were there to prepare what we thought was going to be a broader sort of validation exercise that was initially intended for this Thursday, but we wanted to take more time. As we went into drafting this, redrafting the RNAG to strengthen the dimensions of conflict sensitivity and so forth, when we spoke to people, we realized a few things. One is the RNAG is a good basis, but we wanted to broaden it, and let's see if we can build in some other dimensions of crisis, which will be one of my discussion points maybe for tomorrow. By crisis meaning, can we use this as a somewhat rapid or lighter guide that looks at the marriage of not just education, rapid needs assessment, but also conflict analysis? Can we bring in some dimensions of disaster vulnerability, disaster risk analysis, perhaps analysis that brings in indicators and measurements and some prompts for organized violence and crime, the crisis dimension. That's one element of it. Another element was preparing the guide so that it is a tool that can prepare a USAID education officer or a partner to go down the path of the RNAG, but if the choice is made that the RNAG may not be the right tool because staff may want to pursue a more comprehensive conflict analysis, we give them some options to go more in depth into using those other tools. So up front, we're more clear about managing expectations of the readers, what the guide is not, giving some references to other existing tools that are out there. There's a number of tools that are both conflict analyses, tools that are disaster risk analyses, and so forth. And so we're trying to help this piece assist an education officer more broadly and make some decisions. And so we're looking to modify that right now. We're modifying it right now. Where we stand is that as we were preparing it over the past few weeks, some opportunities arose where we realized that given the complexity of adapting it for field use, we thought field testing this is really best. So rather than pursue a sort of validation exercise at this stage, let's field test it. We might have a couple of opportunities within the next month and a half, maybe 2 months, and then come back to stakeholders in the ECCN to both give some feedback and debrief from the field testing missions, and then maybe validate some adjustments. But we felt that was the best way to proceed. So we'll be coming out with the first draft in about maybe a week, 2 weeks, I think, at most. Circulating that among stakeholders here and the ECCN more broadly, getting that feedback, fine-tuning it, and setting it up for the first field mission, which is to be decided still, but we're having some indications that maybe we can pull it off in maybe by August or so, but let's see. And so there are a number of issues that are arising, and I'll close on 4.2 on this point, which is that when you're marrying conflict analysis or risk analysis, as I'm terming it, and education analysis, you have to make some heavy prioritization in terms of how far you want to go down the path in terms of conflict analysis. So what is that, if I may, sweet spot of prioritization? What are the essential questions you have to ask for an RNAG, and then what's the best way to guide a reader to use tools that can guide you to go more deeply if you want. Okay, 4.3 is looking ahead a little bit, but it will be closely based upon a lot of the conversations and efforts that we mentioned already, especially what Ash was just talking about in terms of theories of change. So developing guidance and tools for how do you actually design conflict-sensitive education programs. I think some of the genesis of this was the recognition that the conflict sensitivity checklist was useful as a checklist, but didn't actually guide you on how to plan a program. Should you go through the checklist and realize, oh, you had a conflict sensitivity deficit, and you scored yourself low, well, what do you then do about it? So the checklist was useful in raising that awareness, but then how do you then adjust your planning to make your program more conflict sensitive? So guidance that goes in that direction. And it will be accompanied by professional development resources. It will ideally draw on findings from the theories of change work, because planning heavily revolves around theories of change. and also more discussions with USAID on what really works in form and content. So this is a lot of what I've been dealing with and we've been discussing as well, which is you don't get the form right, there's not going to be any content. What's the most user-friendly type of format and tool that will achieve the behavior change that we want of staff, partners, us on the ground. Lastly, the second bullet here, explore orienting modules according to the USAID program planning cycle. I put this down as a reminder to us and to myself too, which is that we are all pulling together different pieces of the professional development pie with tools and guidance and so forth. We want to make sure that it aligns with what a USAID education officer and a partner is most familiar with in terms of their planning cycle life. I mean, situational analysis, design, planning, monitoring, and evaluation, and so forth. So in terms of developing guidance on conflict-sensitive program planning, we want to make sure that it is oriented to that officer's reality on the ground and the cycle of the USAID program planning cycle. So here on this page, it's a combination of two things. One is some of the preliminary thoughts for what could be your two ideas, and then the broader key questions, really. The first bullet, professional development and conflict-sensitive education program design. This would follow the guidance and tool, which we would anticipate to be done by the end of the year. What I should have also added is that perhaps we can explore professional development for the ultimate analytical tool, the draft RNAG, as it ultimately is honed after the field missions. Possibly guidance or tool on how to engage marginalized stakeholder groups. This came up in a number of our conversations, something sort of targeted and very concrete, because in a number of your work, obviously, from situation analysis, policy development, and so forth, working with government or with partners, the challenge of equitable access means you've got to reach out to the previously unreached and to hear what they have to say, what their needs are. That in these contexts means you have to do that in a conflict-sensitive way. So we've heard some calls from various consultations on how to do that, on the need to learn how to do that. Third, possibly a guidance or tool on education program design that addresses all major risks. And this prompts one of the questions for the group, which is, do we want to help an education officer in a, let's say, DRC or a Haiti or Pakistan, where equitable access to school means school safety, for instance, and other considerations that relate to a range of hazards. In these contexts, it's not just armed violence, insurgent groups, it's also disaster vulnerabilities and so forth. Why don't we try to take a coherent, integrated approach so that you can at least identify priority risks in your analysis, identify theories of change which help you bring this all together, because in a school setting, the school experiences all of those hazards, all of those threats. So why don't we try to have a more coherent programming approach? And that prompts the key questions. I'll start with the second one, which is then how can the ECCN better address the other C? We're talking a lot about conflict, but crisis is in our mix as well. What about disasters, natural disasters, droughts, instabilities, coups, insurgencies, and so forth, gang violence in Latin America? What should the ECCN do to bring in the other C? Should we? How much? And so forth. The first bullet, how can the ECCN and the Peace Building and Conflict Sensitivity Knowledge Sharing Group strike the optimal form and content for professional development products? Basically, what I mean by that is, when we take the findings and the products from the research team and we distill it, and we think this can become something that is very, very concrete and useful in the form of a tool or guidance for the field, what does that really look like? And then lastly, what would be the best way that the ECCN can follow up the application of the rollout, the application of these tools, and how can we create a mechanism or a resource for the lessons learned from the applications of these tools, both in terms of professional development, but also possibly also what works in terms of evidence, and what new lessons will this generate in terms of research. So some general questions, and I think I also should have touched on the fact that we have begun conversations to launch our knowledge sharing group. we'll probably launch it in the next month. And we'll do that virtually. So we've had a lot of stakeholder conversations with the peace building and conflict sensitivity knowledge sharing group, setting the agenda, roles, and so forth. And we've had a number of members in all these conversations, but I think we'll pull our first meeting together, most likely virtually, in July. And I think all members have all said they would all like to have some involvement in Objective 4. So I want to make sure that, although you saw my mug up there off in the corner doing this, this is heavily an ECCN-wide KSG related effort. I'll stop there. Saji and Susan?
I'm gonna try to, I'm hearing a lot of terms like tools development, and I'm thinking of a person who is sitting in an office in a mission somewhere, who is bombarded with tons of tools, and I'm bombarded with multiple bureaus giving multiple tools, I presume. So how are we going to ensure that all the work we are putting together is actually going to have a utility and not a burden on the person to be effective? So I'm sensitive to how do we manage this issue. So because this is a conversation we are dealing with at a peace building level with multiple agencies as well. So something I want to make sure we are thinking about, not just interested in our own agenda here. So
yeah, and that's been front and center in all of our conversations on this, and this is where this group and also the other knowledge sharing groups can be very helpful.
So how do we do this?
What's the answer?
No, I was going to say, one option is this idea of, to the degree that the tools, let's say, and the products and all that are oriented to USAID, as an example for right now. I mean, they are, but we're a broader community. One is, like I mentioned before about the USAID program management cycle, start with the reality of that education officer, for instance, and if you need to go through these, in simple terms, these steps to manage your program from analysis through evaluation and so forth, then orient products so that they are highly user-friendly for those entry points in that program management cycle. So first, think of orienting whatever you're doing to what is the program management life of that education officer. And we have these conversations now back at UNICEF, and there's no silver bullet. That's one option to look at. The other is just make sure you don't develop anything that is not heavily informed by the people on the ground. And this is also why why I pointed it back to you as implementer. What do you think folks need? But then we also have to reach out to people on the ground and ask people, what do you need? What works for you? So those are just two initial reactions. And another one is keeping things comparatively light. Some of what I'm dealing with on Objective 4 is there's a lot, you know this, there's a lot out there. There's some very, very good work of 75, 80-page documents or 60-page documents. And let's try to explore, and what I think USAID rightfully did in terms of exploring the RNAG, it's how much can we do that gets enough right and that has a sufficient rigor, which is a lighter tool, perhaps, as well.
There are other thoughts, I think, too, and again, I think we'll all begin to get more comfortable with some of these ideas. Partly, I think a little bit to Joel's point, is maybe we need to shift the norms a little bit, and if conflict analysis, or if sort of, before you embark on any kind of an activity, you actually expect that people will understand the context better. That can be put into a lot of different sort of protocols for how work is done. That's one way, that's sort of a formal way. I think another way is, if it's useful, if it in fact does meet a need and it's good, I would like to think that eventually it will rise to the top. Now that's a little bit optimistic, but this is where we also have a role to play in furthering it. And we have focused right now on the USAID aspect of this, but I think implementing partners also, many of them could really benefit from this. How we do it matters, both on the formal side and on the aspects of the tool itself. It matters. And that's again why the ground truthing is going to be important and why a broad understanding of the needs and then how that plays out when you actually apply a tool. All of these things come into it. So, and I'm sorry to cut off the discussion here. We do have Mary who has been with us on the phone this whole time. But we can continue this conversation tomorrow in a much more formative way when we think about next year. So, thank you, Jessica.